Hi, I'm Suzanne Turner, and welcome to a podcast delving into the personal narratives within the clinical research industry. Through candid interviews, we'll learn about the personal journeys and motivations of individuals who have chosen this profession, what I like to call their why. This podcast is not just for industry insiders. It's for everyone curious about the human side of healthcare. Beyond the industry's negative reputation, we'll shed light on the dedicated professionals behind clinical trials. Join us as we uncover the heart and passion of those working tirelessly behind the scenes in clinical research. Welcome to Heart of the Trial. Welcome back, my lovely listeners, to Season 2 of Heart of the Trial. I'm your host, Suzanne Turner, and I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be here, truly. When I launched Season 1, I wasn't entirely sure what to expect. This podcast started as a passion project, a way to spotlight the people and stories behind clinical research, and what's happened since then has just amazed me. I've had people reach out, some I know, many I don't, just to share how an episode resonated with them. I've watched the download numbers go up, and while I know this show isn't pulling the numbers of some huge podcasts, what it is doing is making an impact, and that's everything I hoped for. What surprised me most, though, is how often guests have mentioned the name of the show, Heart of the Trial. It keeps coming up in our conversations, and not just in passing. It's become this touch point that means something different to everyone. Some talk about the patient at the center, others talk about their team or their mission, or even their own personal journey in the industry. I didn't expect that when I named it, but I absolutely love it. It's become clear that Heart of the Trial isn't just a title. It's a space where people can connect with what really drives them. Season 2 is all about expanding that connection. I'll be talking to a wider range of people, folks from inside and outside the industry. I want to explore the full ripple effect of health, how clinical research fits into it, where it begins, and the many lives it touches along the way. And I'll be weaving in a few special solo episodes like this one, where I take a step back to explore something foundational. Today's topic is one I've carried with me for a long time. It's always left an impression on me when I hear about the kinds of things that were done in the past. All the moments in history that shaped the way research is done today. Sometimes I hear people question why we have the processes we do, why there's so much structure, so many rules. When you look back, it becomes really clear. The root of every trial, the whole point, is human safety. It's about improving lives, and the regulations we work within, they're there because people were hurt when they weren't. Just like the teams I support every day, these trials are built to help people. But that only works when we respect the people involved, when we remember why the rules exist in the first place. So, in this episode, we're going to revisit some of the most pivotal and painful moments in research history. And we're going to talk about what those stories mean today, how they've shaped things like informed consent, independent oversight, and trial design. Whether you've been in the industry for years or you're hearing about these events for the first time, I hope you'll come away with a renewed sense of why this work matters. Let's begin. Like many of you, I first learned about World War II in school, probably high school, and I remember hearing about the Nazi experiments. It wasn't until I entered the clinical research world that I really understood their significance, not just as part of history, but as the foundation for the ethical standards we follow today. Because the truth is, what happened was beyond horrifying. It wasn't research. It was cruelty, disguised as science. During the war, Nazi doctors carried out medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners without any consent. And I want to pause here to say, some of what I'm about to share may be difficult to hear, but I think it's important we don't look away from it. One infamous example is the hypothermia experiments. Prisoners were submerged in ice water for hours to simulate conditions faced by German pilots who crashed into the North Sea. Many died from exposure. Others were subjected to extreme rewarming attempts, some with scalding water or being forced into sexual activity to test recovery. There were high-altitude experiments too. Victims were placed in low-pressure chambers and exposed to altitudes equivalent to 65,000 feet to observe how long it would take to lose consciousness and die. Some were dissected immediately after death to study organ damage. There were malaria and typhus experiments where prisoners were deliberately infected with deadly diseases and then either left untreated or given experimental drugs with no proven safety. There were sterilization experiments where chemicals or radiation were used to try and find efficient ways to render people infertile, particularly those the regime considered undesirable. And these are just a few examples. No consent, no oversight, no protection, just systematic torture under the guise of medical advancement. In response to these atrocities, the Nuremberg Code was created in 1947. It laid out 10 principles for ethical human experimentation. The very first and most fundamental was this: the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. I'm going to repeat that. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. That principle became the foundation of informed consent as we know it today. If you're considering joining a clinical trial, the Informed Consent Form, or ICF, is the document that tells you what the study is about, what's expected of you, what the risks are, and what your rights are. But let me be clear, the ICF is not just paperwork, it's a conversation. You have the right to ask any questions. You have the right to understand what you're signing. You have the right to walk away at any time for any reason. I've seen firsthand how overlooked this can be, even now. I once worked with a colleague whose father was enrolling in a trial, and it was because she thoroughly read the ICF that she caught a crucial detail. He wouldn't be able to get dental work for years following the trial. They took action because they understood the document. That's what it's there for. That's why it matters. Another key principle from the Nuremberg Code: avoiding unnecessary risk. Research must be based on sound science. It must minimize harm. The benefits must outweigh the risks. These seem like obvious rules today, but that's because we've inherited them from the ashes of history. And that's why we can't forget. The Nazi experiments were unspeakable, but they forced the world to confront the darkest consequences of unchecked research. And from that, the field of research ethics was born. We still have work to do, but we never, ever go back. This next example is one I only recently learned about, and when I did, it floored me. I couldn't believe I hadn't heard about it before, especially considering how disturbing it is. Not only because of what was done, but because it was done to children. From the mid-1950s through the 1970s, researchers at the Willowbrook State School in Staten Island, New York, conducted a series of hepatitis studies on institutionalized children with intellectual disabilities. The school itself was overcrowded and underfunded, conditions that were already heartbreaking, but the research made things even worse. To study the transmission of hepatitis, children were deliberately infected with the virus, either by ingesting it mixed into food or drink, or through injections. The justification was that hepatitis was already widespread at Willowbrook, so infection was seen as inevitable. But instead of focusing on prevention or treatment alone, the studies became about controlled infection, using children as the test subjects. And here's where it becomes truly sickening. In many cases, parents were told that the only way their child could be admitted to Willowbrook, this overcrowded but necessary care facility, was by agreeing to enroll them in the study. So yes, they signed a consent form. But let's be honest, that's not voluntary. That's coercion. Honestly, the fact that admission was tied to consent in this trial disgusts me. They took something that had a direct impact on these families' lives, access to care, and weaponized it as a form of control. These were parents in tough situations, desperate for help, and the system absolutely took advantage of that. This is one of the clearest examples I can think of to show the difference between consent and informed voluntary consent. Going back to the Nuremberg Code, it says the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Well, if your child's admission to a facility depends on you signing that form, is it really voluntary? This case led to a public outcry once it became more widely known, and it directly contributed to the development of stronger protections for vulnerable populations in research. And it also helped solidify the importance of institutional review boards, or IRBs, independent ethics committees that review every research protocol to ensure that it respects and protects human subjects. And when I think about my own work, I've supported many studies involving vulnerable populations. Children, of course, are a common one, but also women who may be pregnant, non-native English speakers, or individuals with limited capacity to consent. In those cases, the informed consent process isn't just a form, it's a layered approach. You might need guardian consent for minors, separate pregnancy ICFs, or translated forms and certified interpreters to ensure someone truly understands what they're agreeing to. I even remember working on a study where the team had a long conversation about teens. At what age could they consent for themselves? At what point do we start treating them as autonomous agents? These are real discussions we have today because of what happened in places like Willowbrook. It's a reminder that consent is not a checkbox. It's not a one-size-fits-all, and the consequences of getting it wrong are far too high. This next case is another one that I didn't learn about until I was preparing for this episode. And honestly, when I read it, my immediate reaction was, "Are you kidding me?" These were elderly patients, people who had worked their whole lives, who had likely endured hardship, loss, sacrifice. All they wanted was to retire in peace, to be taken care of, and instead, they were used. In 1963, at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in Brooklyn, researchers injected live cancer cells into the bodies of elderly patients to study immune response. The patients weren't told. They weren't asked. They were lied to. They were told the injections were routine, but in reality, they were part of an experiment to understand how the body responds to cancerous cells. Let that sink in. These individuals had no idea what was being done to them. Their families, who trusted the hospital to care for them, had no idea. There was no informed consent, no documentation, no meaningful oversight. And that's what struck me the most. These patients were vulnerable in every sense. Their families believed they were in good hands, but those hands were being guided by a research agenda, not by ethical care. Now, I want to believe that something like this could never happen today. That deception of this scale in a research setting just wouldn't make it past the first step. We have layers and layers of oversight, protocol reviews, informed consent processes, monitoring plans, training, audits, and at the core of all that is trust. But sometimes humans surprise me, and not always in a good way. So how do we guard against it? We guard against it by doing the work, by following the processes, but also by empowering everyone at every level, study coordinators, nurses, CRAs, even the participants themselves, to speak up. If something doesn't look right, sound right, feel right, it probably isn't. And it's not someone else's job to say something, it's all of ours. This case also really reinforces why IRBs exist. Their job is to ask hard questions, to challenge assumptions, to require clarity and transparency. And sometimes that back and forth can feel frustrating. I've seen it myself. Being in the trial master file world, I may not be in the room when the IRB discussions happen, but I see them. I've seen long email chains and document revisions where IRBs are asking for clarifications, rewording of consent language, demanding better explanations of risk. And I'm grateful for it because that's their job and it's what keeps participants safe. And when I think about elderly patients specifically, I absolutely see them as a vulnerable population. We often talk about that label in the context of children or economically disadvantaged individuals, but the elderly, especially those with cognitive decline or serious illness, are equally vulnerable. As we age, we can return to a state where we need help understanding things, where we rely on loved ones to advocate for us. So trials involving elderly participants need to reflect that, whether that's through more thorough consent discussions, including family members, or carefully weighing whether a study's risks are appropriate given someone's stage of life. I know IRBs aren't always everyone's favorite step, just like working with a quality department or going through an audit. It can feel like you're being slowed down or second guessed. But if you're experiencing that pushback, if things are being rejected or revised again and again, take a deep breath and remember they're doing their job and they're doing it for the patient. Because back in 1963, no one was there to do that. And look what happened. The Tuskegee syphilis study is probably one of the most well-known examples of unethical research in U.S. history, and it should be. To be honest, I can't even remember exactly when I first learned about it. It's something I've known about for a long time. It's one of those stories that has hung in the air for decades, especially for those who've been personally affected by it. From 1932 to 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service ran a study in Tuskegee, Alabama, to observe the progression of syphilis in African American men. The participants were never told they had the disease. They were told they had bad blood. They were never properly treated. Even after penicillin became the widely accepted treatment, they were intentionally denied access so researchers could continue to study how the disease developed over time. And while the study was written about in medical journals, the real public reckoning didn't happen until 1972, 40 years later, when it hit the media and the public truly understood what had happened. What stands out to me most is that, sadly, it didn't shock me. Not when you think about the time period. Black individuals simply weren't given the importance or respect they deserved. Medical research, particularly in that era, wasn't inclusive. It wasn't built on justice or equality. Even now, while we've made progress toward improving diversity in research, I do think there's still a long way to go. It speaks to a deeper issue that's been embedded in research practices for a long time. Historically, medical research has prioritized one type of person, the white male. That's who most trials were designed around. That's who the data reflects. So whether it's a woman, people of color, people from different age groups, or even geographic regions, anyone who doesn't fit that profile wasn't adequately represented in the data that shaped our medicine. In my own work, I haven't been part of the early discussions where inclusion criteria are developed, but I've worked closely with protocols and trial master file content, and I know how critical that inclusion and exclusion section is. That's where it's defined, who's included, who's left out, and why, and that matters. After Tuskegee, the public outcry led to something foundational, the Belmont Report, published in 1979. It laid out 3 core ethical principles that now guide human subject research in the US and many other countries. 1, respect for persons, which includes the idea that individuals should enter research voluntarily with informed consent. 2, beneficence, the obligation to do no harm and to maximize benefits while minimizing risks. And 3, justice, the fair distribution of the burdens and benefits of research. That last one, justice, is what I think about most when it comes to studies like Tuskegee. Because when a population is asked to participate in research but doesn't receive the benefits, or worse, is actively harmed, that's the opposite of justice. And if someone today is hesitant to join a study because of what happened in Tuskegee, I get it. I would never try to talk them out of that hesitation. I'd listen, and then I'd say this: the fact that you're being invited to participate and that you're thinking about it, that's already a shift. You have the right to ask every question you need. You have the right to read the informed consent front to back and decide if this is right for you. You have the right to say no. And you also have the right to say yes, knowing that your participation might help shape better treatment for people just like you in the future. There's still work to be done in rebuilding trust, but that work starts with honesty, accountability, and real change. And I hope conversations like this one are part of that change. The story of Henrietta Lacks is one that stayed with me for years. And honestly, it still gives me pause every time I talk about informed consent. I first read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks probably 7 or 8 years ago, while I was working full-time at a CRO and finishing my bachelor's degree. One of my courses required us to read a book and write a paper on it. And I knew I wanted to choose something that connected to what I was actually doing in clinical research. I had heard the name Henrietta Lacks somewhere in the industry, just in passing, but I didn't know the full story. Once I did, I never forgot it. In 1951, Henrietta Lacks was a young Black woman being treated for cervical cancer at Johns Hopkins. During a biopsy, a sample of her tumor was taken, without her knowledge or consent. Those cells became known as HeLa cells, and they would go on to become one of the most important tools in modern medicine. HeLa cells were the first human cells to be successfully grown outside the body. They were used in developing the polio vaccine, in cancer research, and gene mapping, in COVID vaccine testing, and the list goes on. They're still being used today. It literally gives me goosebumps talking about it. I have goosebumps right now. But while science advanced, her family was left in the dark. They didn't even know her cells were being used until decades later. They never gave permission. They never benefited financially. And Henrietta, during her life, was treated as someone who didn't matter. Her contribution, one of the most consequential in medical history, was completely unacknowledged. When I reflect on Henrietta's story, a few things stand out. First, she was part of a vulnerable population. She didn't know the questions to ask. She trusted her doctors, like most of us do. There was no conversation, no explanation, just a system that didn't see her as someone who deserved agency over her body. It doesn't surprise me, sadly, that her cells were used for decades without her or her family knowing. And while I don't have the firsthand experience to speak deeply on how biospecimen handling is managed today, I do know that we have many more layers of process in place now. I've seen consent forms specifically for long-term sample use, and sometimes even separate ones if a sample is going to be stored or reused in future research. We have labeling protocols, chain of custody logs, and computerized tracking systems to ensure things are properly documented. But still, we owe it to Henrietta and her family to keep doing better. Because this story is the clearest possible reminder of something I've tried to emphasize throughout this episode. Clinical research is about people who are trusting us, people who are giving of themselves, sometimes at incredibly vulnerable moments in their lives, in the hope that what they're doing might help someone else down the road. I think about Henrietta a lot when it comes to informed consent. When I hear someone say it's just a signature, I think of her. When I review a process that feels rushed or impersonal, I think of her. And when I build out training or documentation, I try to make sure it reflects the care and dignity that every participant deserves. So, yes, Henrietta's cells changed the world, but the way she was treated changed the way we talk about ethics, about consent, about respect. And that's why her story had to be part of this episode, because the theme here is clear. We honor participants by protecting them, by respecting their choices, and by remembering that every form, every protocol, every sample represents a human being, and that matters. This next story was one I hadn't heard about until I started researching for this episode, and I'll be honest, it broke my heart. Jesse Gelsinger was just 18 years old when he died during a clinical trial for a gene therapy treatment in 1999. He had a rare metabolic disorder called ornithine transcarbamylase deficiency, an X-linked condition that affects the liver's ability to eliminate ammonia from the bloodstream. Jesse's case was relatively mild, and he was managing it through medication and diet. But he volunteered for a study at the University of Pennsylvania that was testing a new gene therapy. The idea was to deliver a healthy copy of the gene into the liver using a modified virus. It was an early experimental therapy, first in human, high-risk science. Just days after receiving the treatment, Jesse went into multi-organ failure and died. And then came the revelations. There had been safety issues in previous animal studies that hadn't been fully disclosed. Another patient in the trial had experienced serious side effects, but that information wasn't shared with new participants. And the lead investigator, Dr. James Wilson, had a financial stake in the company developing the therapy. When I read all of that, I was just sad, deeply, overwhelmingly sad. And then I got angry because this wasn't just about science. This was about someone's child, someone who believed in the promise of what research could do and who deserved to be protected by the very people running the trial. It absolutely shocked me how many red flags were missed or even ignored. Prior safety concerns, lack of transparency, conflicts of interest, it was a perfect storm of ethical breakdowns. And it's also a sharp reminder of why the informed consent process is so much more than just a form. Participants need to know the risks, not the sugar-coated version, not the ideal scenario version, the real version, especially in early phase high-risk studies. It also highlights the importance of investigator financial disclosure forms. And yes, that's a very real thing. As someone who works with the trial master file, I've seen hundreds, maybe thousands of those forms. In every clinical trial, investigators are required to disclose any financial interest they have in the outcome of the study, whether it's owning equity in the company, receiving consulting fees, or having a patent tied to the product. The idea isn't to ban all relationships, but to identify them and monitor them closely so no one's judgment is clouded by personal gain. Honestly, it's upsetting to me that financial conflicts are even allowed at all, but they are. And so we have to be vigilant because the moment someone forgets that this isn't just about data, it's about people, that's when things go wrong. I'm proud to say that in the teams I've worked with, I've seen a consistent commitment to protecting patient safety. We're not just checking boxes, we're remembering why we're doing the work in the first place. And that's what this case really comes down to. Jesse's death wasn't just a medical event, it was an ethical failure. And it reminds us that the investigator's role isn't just scientific, it's human. We need to make sure they're in it for the right reasons, because behind every protocol is a person. And if we ever lose sight of that, we lose everything. The thalidomide tragedy is one of the most devastating drug safety failures in modern history, and one that dramatically reshaped how we approach risk in clinical trials and drug approvals. I first learned about thalidomide during my GCP training at the CRO where I worked. It was part of the foundational ethics material, and for good reason. Thalidomide was first developed in the late 1950s and marketed as a mild sedative and anti-nausea medication. It was prescribed heavily to pregnant women, particularly in Europe and other countries, to help with morning sickness. But what no one realized until it was too late was that thalidomide interfered with fetal development. The result was catastrophic. Thousands of children were born with severe limb deformities, underdeveloped organs, or no limbs at all. My feelings about this come in two stages. First, of course, my heart breaks for the children who were affected. But also, I think about the women who were simply trying to feel better, who were doing what they were told was safe, and they were trusting the system to protect them and their child. That trust was violated. And what this also makes me think about, especially now, is off-label drug use. Because the reality is that a lot of medications are approved for one condition, and then we discover they're helpful for something else. Sometimes that's amazing, but sometimes it's risky. Take Viagra, for example. Originally developed to treat hypertension and anergia, apologies if I said that wrong, researchers unexpectedly discovered that it helped with erectile dysfunction. That discovery gave the drug a whole new purpose, but it also raised a big question. Just because a drug does something helpful, does that mean we should immediately use it that way without proper testing? Even in my own life, I've been prescribed medications for off-label use. Years ago, I was prescribed a drug to help with migraines. It was originally developed for patients with seizures. I wasn't really aware of what that meant at the time, but the side effects for me were significant, particularly memory loss. It really impacted me, and it reminded me that just because a drug is approved doesn't mean it's right for everything. And that's exactly what thalidomide forced the world to confront. Here in the US, thalidomide was never approved, thanks in large part to one woman, Dr. Frances Kelsey, a physician and pharmacologist at the FDA. She saw inconsistencies in the data submitted for thalidomide and refused to authorize it until more testing was done. And because she spoke up, the US avoided a massive wave of birth defects. One person, one decision that made a difference. And that's why today we have phased clinical trials, starting with small safety studies before anything ever gets near a widespread population. That's why we have FDA inspections. That's why we have adverse event reporting systems and preclinical toxicity studies and medical monitoring teams. I do think we've come a long way. New drug approvals today are heavily regulated and carefully monitored. But I still see echoes of thalidomide and how we use off-label drugs, especially post-marketing. It's a reminder that science needs structure and patients need protection, not just when a drug is new, but long after it's on the shelf. And it's another reminder for patients to be informed. Ask your doctor what the drug is for. Ask if it's FDA approved for the specific use. Pay attention, because at the end of the day, it's your health. You deserve answers. While thalidomide reshaped how we approve drugs, the case of Vioxx reminded us that even after approval, the work isn't done. Vioxx was a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug developed by Merck, widely prescribed in the late 1990s and early 2000s for arthritis and general pain relief. It was effective and popular. But what wasn't clear right away was the growing body of data linking it to an increased risk of heart attacks and strokes. By the time it was voluntarily withdrawn from the market in 2004, it's estimated that tens of thousands of people may have been affected. This wasn't an issue of poor science in the lab. This was a case of insufficient post-market surveillance and delayed recognition of safety signals. And what that tells us is that approval isn't the finish line. It's just one checkpoint. The safety of a medication doesn't stop mattering the day it becomes available. It continues as real people start using it in the real world. People who might have other health conditions, take other medications, or face risks that weren't fully captured in the clinical trial. That's where pharmacovigilance comes in. That's where safety monitoring plans and required post-marketing studies come in. That's where transparency matters. And Vioxx wasn't the last time we learned this lesson. Take Belviq, a weight loss drug approved in 2012 and withdrawn in 2020 when post-market studies showed a possible increased risk of cancer. Or Zantac, once a staple for heartburn relief, pulled from shelves when it was found that the drug could degrade into NDMA, a probable carcinogen, especially when stored long-term or at high temperatures. These aren't stories from the distant past. They're recent, they're real, and they reinforce the idea that we have to keep watching, not just during trials, but after. Not just for efficacy, but for emerging risks. And not just because the FDA says so, but because people are depending on us to do the right thing, even when it's inconvenient. I think about this a lot, how easy it might be for someone to assume that once the last patient visit is complete or the data is locked, the job is done. But that's just one milestone. The trial may be over on paper, but the impact of that drug or device continues well beyond that point. And so does our responsibility to the patients who participated, to the people who will eventually use it, and to the future decisions built on that data. And as patients, we need to be mindful too. Just like with off-label use, we should always feel empowered to ask questions about our medications. How long have they been on the market? Have there been any safety updates? Are there risks that affect people with our specific health conditions? The good news is, we have more access than ever before. A quick Google search or visiting websites like clinicaltrials.gov or FDA.gov can offer real insights into how a drug is being studied, what side effects have been reported, or whether new information has emerged. We don't need to rely on blind trust. We can ask, research, and advocate for ourselves and our loved ones. Because vigilance isn't just a regulatory task. It's a shared responsibility from the sponsor to the doctor to the patient. And the more we all understand that, the better protected we'll be. As we wrap up this episode, I want to pause for a moment, not just to summarize what we've covered, but to reflect on what it all means. We've walked through some of the darkest moments in clinical research history, from Nazi experiments in Willowbrook to Tuskegee, Henrietta Lacks, Jesse Gelsinger, and beyond. These stories are hard to hear. They should be, because they're not just stories. They're reminders of what happens when people are treated like data points instead of human beings. And yet, out of these tragedies came something else, something better, a framework that didn't exist before. Things like informed consent, independent ethics review, post-market surveillance, regulatory oversight. These aren't just boxes to check. They're the foundation of good clinical practice, and they exist because people were once failed. Sometimes I think we forget just how much history lives behind the forms and the processes, behind every protocol, behind every audit, behind every page of that 60-page ICF. It's easy to see these things as tedious or redundant or just paperwork. But they are the result of real harm and a promise that it won't happen again. And for those outside the industry, I know there are still misconceptions. I've heard it. People imagining clinical trials as dark labs and rats in cages. But that's not the reality. More often than not, it's a patient going to their doctor's office, It's a nurse collecting vitals. It's someone's loved one participating in the hope that it helps them or someone else. That's why informed consent still matters so much. It's not just a form, it's your right, your protection, your voice, and your decision. So if you're listening to this episode as someone considering joining a clinical trial, or you know someone who is, here's what I want you to know. You have the right to ask any question you want. You have the right to take your time. You don't owe anyone a signature, and you have the right to walk away at any point. But also know that by participating, you might be doing something incredible. You may not benefit directly. You might be randomized. You might receive a placebo. But your involvement could change the life of someone else. And even if it only helps one person, isn't that something? And if you don't feel confident in the answers you're getting from your doctor or investigator, reach out. There's usually contact information for the sponsor team right in the informed consent form. Use it. There's a reason I named this podcast Heart of the Trial. And this episode, this is what it really means. That at the core of every protocol, every milestone, and every advancement is a person with a name, a story, a choice, and a right to be treated with dignity. We owe it to the past, to every person who was harmed, ignored, or forgotten, to never lose sight of that. And we owe it to the future to keep doing better. I also want to say this. I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts on this episode. Not just how it makes you feel, but if you'd want to hear more like it. Would you be interested in deeper dives into specific events or ethics topics in the future episodes? I'd love to know. And just as a note, what I've shared today reflects my own views and experience. These are my opinions shaped by my work in clinical research and my personal reflections. This isn't meant as medical or regulatory advice, but as a starting point for conversation, one I hope continues with you. Until next time, stay curious and stay compassionate.
This brings us to the end of today's episode. I want to extend my sincere thanks to our guest for sharing their inspiring journey. If you'd like to connect with them, you can find their contact information in the show notes. I also want to express my gratitude to you for joining us on this exploration of the clinical research industry. I hope you found today's episode insightful. If so, please consider leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform. It truly helps us reach more listeners. If you have any feedback, questions, or comments about the show, feel free to email me at podcast@iceconsultingllc.com. Thank you once again, and I look forward to having you joining us on our next episode of Heart of the Trial.